Zohran Mamdani showed up for a debate. Jessica Tarlov came to confront him. She challenged his policies, accusing them of romanticizing class struggle and promoting unrealistic ideals that threaten social cohesion. But what happened next stunned everyone watching. Zohran didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He responded with calm conviction and turned the entire conversation upside down. Within minutes, Jessica stood up and walked off set. But the story didn't end there. What happened next, off camera, was even more powerful than what aired. Before we get into it, drop where you are watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happened when a democratic socialist and a centrist commentator collided on live television. It was supposed to be just another panel, a spirited exchange, maybe a few barbs traded across the table, and then back to commercial. But this episode of The Five would become something else entirely. Something no one on set or watching at home was prepared for. They teased it all day. A surprise guest would be joining the panel. No one expected Zohran Mamdani, not in person, not this, not unfiltered. The moment he stepped onto the stage, the energy shifted. The crowd stirred. Greg Gutfeld cracked a half joke about the revolution walking in wearing a Nehru jacket and carrying rent control pamphlets instead of Molotovs. Zohran just smiled slightly, measured, present. He didn't need to say much. The room leaned in instinctively, but Jessica Tarlov wasn't leaning. She kept her arms folded, her expression unreadable. The producers had planned for this. Sparks meant ratings, but what they got was a political earthquake. Right after the intro, Jesse Waters leaned forward. "Zohran," he said with a grin, "you've got half the city chanting your name and the other half afraid you'll nationalize their property. What brings you to the Five?" Zohran didn't flinch. Thought it might be time to have a real conversation about who owns power and who deserves a voice. That was it, 10 words, and suddenly all eyes turned to Jessica. She didn't wait. "I'll be honest," she said, straightening her notes. "Your ideas may sound noble, but they often ignore economic realities. You've romanticized revolution, vilified landlords, and frankly, you advocate for a version of politics that doesn't work in the world we live in today." A murmur ran through the studio. Mamdani looked at her, not with hostility, not even surprise, but with something quieter, focus. He leaned back, folded his hands. "Economic reality," he repeated slowly, as if testing the phrase. "Or just inequality that's been normalized for so long, it feels like truth." Gutfeld raised an eyebrow. Dana Perino bit her lip. Even Jesse looked unsure where this was headed. Jessica didn't blink. "But that's just it. You portray systems like housing or policing as inherently oppressive. Your narratives fuel distrust, and sometimes even rage, toward institutions that still hold society together. Don't you think that glorifies something dangerous?" Zohran looked down for a moment, then back at her. "Or maybe it just forces us to look in the mirror," he said quietly. And for a moment, she didn't have a comeback. The tension was thick. No one shouted, no one interrupted, but it was electric. The camera cut to commercial, and everyone watching knew this wasn't over, not even close. By the end of the hour, someone would walk off that set. Someone else would walk away with a nation hanging on every word he had just calmly delivered. But you won't believe what actually made Jessica Tarlov leave her chair. That moment, her breaking point, is coming. But first, you have to understand why this conversation couldn't be avoided, why it had to happen. Because this wasn't just about policy, it was about everything simmering beneath the surface of American life. And Zohran Mamdani was about to turn the heat all the way up. You could feel it in the silences, sharper now, measured, heavy. Jessica Tarlov sat straighter in her chair, pen tapping lightly against her notes. Across from her, Zohran Mamdani didn't move much, but he didn't have to. He had the room, and everyone in it knew it. Donna tried to soften the moment. "Zohran, let me ask, when you support measures like rent cancellation or abolishing ICE, do you expect them to become lightning rods in the culture wars?" Zohran took a breath. "No," he said calmly. "I expect them to make people uncomfortable. That's the point of politics. It's not supposed to keep everyone comfortable." Jessica jumped in quick. "But that discomfort often aligns with a particular worldview. You push policies that sound idealistic, even utopian. Cancel rent, defund police, dismantle capitalism. You paint systems as inherently oppressive, and suddenly the solution always looks like tearing things down. There it was again, that word, tearing down. Zohran didn't blink. And yet, he replied, I've never proposed change without also naming what should be built in its place. That line landed hard. Even Greg Gutfeld stopped mid-sentence. Jessica hesitated just for a moment. But that reconstruction is often buried beneath slogans. Do people walk away thinking deeply about systems, or do they just repeat the chant? Zohran looked toward the camera, not into it, but just past it. You don't get to control how people interpret your message. You just make it honest. And if it's honest, it stays with them, long after the chant fades. For a second, then, there was nothing but the low hum of the studio lights. Then Jesse chimed in. But isn't that exactly the debate we need? What is political speech for? Jessica, don't you think it's a little narrow to judge ideas only by how they might be misused? Jessica sighed, but her voice stayed firm. No, Jesse, I think we have to be more critical than ever. We have to ask what we're normalizing, especially when the people spreading those ideas hold platforms with massive reach. Zohran didn't miss a beat. And we also have to ask what we're afraid of. Are we afraid of radical ideas? Or just uncomfortable because they force us to admit the system isn't working the way we wish it did? That made her pause. It wasn't deflection, it wasn't posturing, it was conviction. And for a moment, just a moment, you could see it land. Jessica flipped through her notes again, as if searching for something, anything that would hit back with the same weight. Dana tried once more gently. Isn't it possible both things are true? That radical ideas can be powerful even if they're uncomfortable? Even if they're flawed? Jessica looked at Dana, then back at Zohran. Maybe, but I still think responsibility matters. Zohran nodded once. Then maybe the real question is, who decides what responsible politics looks like? Another silence followed, but this one didn't feel empty. It felt like the conversation was shifting. They weren't just talking about policy anymore. They were talking about America, and it was only just beginning to boil. The next question came through a producer's earpiece. Greg Gutfeld read it aloud with a smirk. So Zohran, let's cut to it. Do you think progressivism today has lost its backbone? The audience chuckled. Zohran didn't. He shifted slightly, leaning toward the panel for the first time. Politics used to mean fighting for the people who had nothing, he said plainly. Now it too often means choosing which brand of inequality we're okay with. Jessica raised an eyebrow. You say that like taking a side is a weakness. It is, he answered, when you pretend it's the only side that exists. You could feel the panel freeze, not out of offense, but out of uncertainty. How do you argue with a man who isn't trying to win, just trying to speak? Jessica wasn't backing down. Let's not pretend your ideas are neutral. The rent crisis, the ICE raids, the Inwacha scandals, they all push a perspective. Zohran nodded. Of course they do. Every story does. But I don't make propaganda. I raise questions. Some people just don't like where those questions point. Jessica fired back instantly. And some people don't see the difference between a question and a message, especially when it comes with a slogan and a carefully timed viral video. For a moment, Zohran just looked at her, steady and unshaken. That's not my problem, that's yours. You could hear an audible gasp from someone off camera. Dana looked like she was holding her breath. Jesse muttered, "Wow," under his breath. Jessica sat back, her eyes narrowing. So just to be clear, she said slowly, if someone hears your speech, walks away angrier, more paranoid, more tribal, you don't feel responsible? Zohran's reply was soft, too soft. I feel responsible for the truth in the message, not for the fear someone brings into it. That hit harder than if he had raised his voice. Greg tried to break the tension. Okay, before this turns into eviction court, he joked weakly. Zohran cut in, calm but firm. Eviction court has more nuance than most political commentary these days. And just like that, the conversation was back on. Jessica wasn't smiling now. Well, maybe nuance is harder when people are tired of being misrepresented, she said. You want to talk about complicated systems? What about all the people who never get to be heard in your speeches? Where are the working mothers? The small landlords who aren't predatory? The families who feel trapped between broken policies and broken promises? Zoran's expression didn't change. They're there. You just have to stop looking for them with a checklist. And there it was, that line, the one that turned the audience from simply listening to leaning forward. Because this wasn't just about policies anymore. This was about what we expect from our culture, what we demand from our leaders, and who gets to draw the line between honest and offensive. Jessica leaned into her mic, jaw set. Then maybe you need to look harder at what you're putting into the world. Zohran looked right back, calm, centered. Maybe you need to look harder at what you're afraid to see. The air cracked. Dana reached for her coffee. Jesse looked down. Greg actually stopped talking. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a reckoning. And the next segment would break it wide open. Jessica Tarlov stared straight ahead, not at the camera, not at Zohran Mamdani, just into the space between. Her hands were still, her notes untouched. Greg tried to reset the tone. Well, that escalated quickly, he said nervously. Let's pivot. Zohran, you've been organizing for years. What's changed most? The messaging, the audience, or the institutions? Zohran took a moment before answering. The appetite for truth has shrunk, he said. People want affirmation, not confrontation. They don't show up to be challenged. They show up to be comforted. Jessica jumped in. Or maybe they're just tired of being lectured by people who don't live like them, who don't look like them, who don't carry the same burdens. Zohran turned toward her fully now. Art, or politics, isn't a mirror to make you feel good. It's supposed to make you look, even when you don't like what you see. Jessica leaned in, voice low but firm. You think your activism speaks truth, but it often speaks from power, not to it. Zohran didn't flinch. Truth isn't determined by who says it. It's in the saying itself. That line hung in the air like a hammer on stone. Dana finally broke in. But isn't that exactly why we need these discussions? Culture is changing. Audiences are changing. Maybe the challenge is how we adapt without compromising. Jessica turned to Dana. Now the challenge is accountability. When political narratives shape how people see the world, the storyteller doesn't get to walk away like the work is done. Zohran replied slowly, calmly, I've never walked away. I stayed, I organized, I listened, and I kept saying the things that made people ask questions, even when they hated the answers. Jessica shook her head. But those questions always come from the same angle. You speak for the tenant who's angry, the activist who's fed up, the voice that says, burn it all down. What about everyone else? What about the people caught in the middle? Now Zohran leaned in, not with heat, but with precision. The tenant who's angry isn't the threat. He's the warning. Ignore him, mock him, erase him, and you don't get peace. You get collapse. Jessica's voice rose, just slightly. And what about the woman who's tired of living in fear? Not from a landlord, but from the instability your rhetoric unleashes? The fear that some systems will be shattered before anything better takes their place? The studio went silent again. Not because they didn't care, but because everyone in the room understood. They were no longer on a talk show. They were inside the fight for the cultural soul of the country. Zohran broke the pause, but not with a rebuttal. I don't build heroes, he said softly. I elevate people. Jessica blinked. Greg exhaled. Jesse finally spoke. So what happens, he asked, when the audience sees those people as heroes anyway? Zohran looked down, then back up. Then maybe it says more about the audience than the speech. And just like that, the room shifted again. Not louder, just sharper, more alive. The next commercial break came too late. The control room was scrambling. Producers whispered into earpieces, but it didn't matter anymore. This was no longer about Zohran Mamdani or Jessica Tarlov. This was about all of us. and something in Jessica's eyes said she was about to take it further than anyone expected. The tension wasn't just simmering, it was about to spill. Jessica didn't wait for a prompt. She turned her body fully towards Zohran, her voice low but unmistakably sharp. "You know what bothers me most," she said. "It's not just the policies. It's the silence that follows. You stir something up in people, and that disappear behind the excuse of movement politics. Meanwhile, others, women, immigrants, working-class folks, are left to clean up the reaction." Zohran didn't look away. "You assume reaction is my responsibility, but maybe the audience deserves more credit. Maybe they're not as fragile as you think." Jessica shook her head. "That's not credit, that's negligence." Greg Gutfeld tried to jump in. "All right, but Jessica kept going, relentless. "No, let's actually say it. You've built a brand around agitating the system, and that mythology has consequences. It teaches people that patience is complicity, that compromise is betrayal, that rage is the only language worth speaking." She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her words came fast, sharp, deliberate. Zohran sat still, watching her the way a sculptor studies marble before the first strike. Calm, calculated. Then he said, "And yet here you are, full of emotion, commanding the room. No megaphone, no protest sign, just words." He gestured around the studio. "You have the platform. You have the power. Maybe the old myth is already broken." Jessica stood up. No warning, no drama, just stood, and everyone froze. "I came here thinking I could have a real discussion," she said. "But what I got was another lecture on how I'm supposed to understand people like the ones you elevate. I'm tired of being told to sit with the discomfort of their rage, but no one ever sits with mine." Greg tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Jessica. She turned toward him, eyes steady. "No, Greg, you're just playing moderator to a legacy that keeps rewriting itself as wisdom, while silencing anything that dares to question it." And with that, she walked off the set, not storming, not flustered, walking, deliberate, controlled, but unmistakably done. The studio didn't know what to do. Dana looked down at her notes. Jesse stared into his coffee cup. Greg opened his mouth, then shut it again. Zohran didn't move. He just watched her leave, and for the first time even the audience at home realized something had shifted. Because this wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a message. She wasn't walking away from the conversation. She was walking away from the rules of it, from the idea that only certain voices deserve to tell the truth, from the assumption that cultural authority belongs to the last man standing, from the belief that rage without reflection is the only language allowed. And Zohran, he didn't gloat, he just waited, because something in him knew the real conversation was just about to begin. Jessica Tarlov had left, and the studio hadn't recovered. Greg cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, that was unexpected." Zohran didn't respond, didn't smirk, didn't celebrate, didn't even shift in his chair. He waited. Donna stepped in gently. "Zohran, if I may, what just happened? How do you see it?" He looked at her, calm. "I see someone who came to speak her truth, and I see a culture that's forgotten how to listen, unless it agrees." Dana nodded slowly. Greg leaned in. "So, do you think Jessica was wrong?" "No," Zohran said plainly. "I think she was honest. But honesty doesn't make you right. It just means you're brave enough to be seen." Jesse finally broke his silence. "But what about accountability?" he asked. "She said your words embolden the wrong kind of reaction, that they leave people more divided, more angry. Do you take any ownership for that?" Zohran turned toward him, calm as ever. "I take ownership of what I say, not of what people do with it. If someone walks away angry, it's not because I told them to be. It's because I showed them something they didn't want to face." He paused. "Good politics doesn't tell people how to feel. It tells them where to look." Greg shook his head. "That's deep, man." Zohran glanced over, slightly amused. "It's not deep. It's old. We just forgot it." Dana leaned forward. "So what's the role of the political leader now in this kind of environment?" He took a moment. To reflect what's real, not what's fashionable. If you're chasing applause, you're not leading. You're selling comfort. That line cut through the room like a blade. Outside the studio, social media was exploding. Clips of the exchange were already going viral. One short reel of Zohran's quiet statement, "I don't build heroes, I elevate people," hit 1 million views in under 20 minutes. But inside the studio, something else was happening. Not agreement, not consensus, respect. Dana tapped her pen against her notes. "Can I ask something personal?" Zohran nodded. "You've been criticized your whole career for tone, for being too radical, too uncompromising. Why keep going?" Zohran looked down for a moment, then up. "Because the moment they stop arguing is the moment I know I've failed." The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was reverent. Greg leaned back, arms crossed. "Man, they don't make them like you anymore." Zohran smiled faintly. "Maybe they don't need to." Everyone looked at him, puzzled. He glanced toward the empty chair. "They're making something new now, and maybe that's exactly what this country needs." And with that, the camera slowly panned out, capturing not just Zohran Mamdani, but the space he left open. The conversation wasn't finished, but it had changed shape. And outside that studio, people were listening. The show ended without its usual banter. No light jokes, no wrap-up smiles, just a quiet fade to black. But the story didn't end there. It was just beginning. Within the hour, clips from The Five dominated social media. One reel showed Jessica walking off, eyes focused, voice unwavering. Another zoomed in on Zohran, sitting still, delivering one line after another with quiet conviction. Twitter split in half. Some called Zohran Mamdani out of touch, a radical, an ideologue out of step with reality. Others called him a masterclass in restraint, a truth teller, the only adult in the room. Jessica Tarlov was praised by progressives for standing her ground, for challenging movement dogma, for refusing to let quiet tone obscure serious implications. But she also faced heat, accusations of being overly sensitive, of misreading intent, of walking out when things got tough. News outlets pounced. The New York Times ran a headline within 2 hours. "Jessica walks, Zohran stays. Who's really listening?" The Daily Caller fired back. Mamdani schools Fox panel, Tarlov storms out in defeat. And then came the op-eds. Writers, political theorists, professors, activists, all weighing in. Some saw the moment as another flashpoint in the American culture war. Others saw something more subtle. Two people speaking truth from entirely different worlds, finally colliding on live television. Inside Fox News, the air was tight. Producers debated whether to invite Jessica back for a follow-up. Others floated rebranding the segment as a special edition on political storytelling. But no one could deny what had happened. Something raw had cracked open in front of millions. And behind the scenes, Jessica sat silently in her dressing room. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Supportive texts from friends, angry ones from strangers. She didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. Instead, she kept replaying Zohran's words in her mind. "Maybe you need to look harder at what you're afraid to see." That stuck, not because she agreed, but because it landed. Down the hall, Zohran sat alone in a quiet green room, sipping water, not speaking, not asking for reactions. He'd been here before, too many times to count. But this one felt different, because unlike city council meetings or campaign town halls, this wasn't scripted. This wasn't polished. And still, he had said what he came to say. Not to win, but to be heard. And whether people liked it or not, they were listening. By midnight, both names were trending. Clips from the episode had surpassed 10 million views across platforms. And a new debate had begun. Not about who won, but about whether conversations like this were even possible anymore. Could two people shaped by different histories, different truths, share a stage without one walking away? That question was now bigger than Zohran or Jessica. It belonged to the audience. And tomorrow, everyone would be watching what happened next. The next morning, the building was quiet. Fox's studio hallways, usually buzzing by 7 a.m., felt hushed. Producers walked faster. Doors shut a little harder. Phones rang longer before being answered. In the control room, footage from the night before looped endlessly. The walk-off, the long pause, the line about fear. Editors debated which segments to republish on social. Legal reviewed every clip, twice, but something else was happening, off camera, something unplanned. Jessica Tarlov returned, not to apologize, not to explain, but to finish. She walked in through a side entrance. Hoodie up, no cameras, no entourage, just silence. Jessica Tarlov didn't want attention. She wanted a room, a laptop, and time. She wasn't angry anymore. She was curious. That was the part most people missed. She hadn't walked off set because she was fragile. She'd walked off because the space she was in couldn't hold what needed to be said. But now she was ready to speak. On her terms. Across the country, Zohran Mamdani sat on a back porch in Queens. Not a studio, not a green room, just a plastic chair, a cup of strong chai, and a view of the skyline filtered through scaffolding. His phone was silent. He hadn't followed the media cycle. He didn't need to. He'd been in the eye of controversy before. He knew the rhythm: shock, outrage, think piece, backlash, fade. But what caught his attention this time wasn't the noise. It was the quiet, the thousands of online comments, not screaming, not mocking, reflecting. One viewer had written, "I didn't agree with either of them, but for the first time I actually listened." And that felt rare. To Zohran, that was the point, not the reaction, the reflection. Back in New York, Jessica opened a blank document. She didn't write a rebuttal. She wrote an invitation, a long-form essay. Not for TV, not for a panel, for readers, for thought. She titled it, "What We Don't Say When the Cameras Are Still Rolling." In it, she unpacked more than just Zohran's ideas. She unpacked her own, her biases, her frustrations, her exhaustion. She acknowledged the cultural gravity Zohran carried and asked why that gravity had never been distributed more equally. She didn't walk anything back, but she walked further in. The essay wasn't angry, it was generous, honest, even vulnerable. And when she finished it, she emailed it to one person, Zohran Mamdani. No intro, no disclaimer, just the piece. 2 hours later, she received a reply, one line. "I read it twice. Thank you for writing it." No signature, no punctuation. Just Zohran doing what he always did, leaving space between the words. And for the first time, it wasn't a debate anymore. It was a dialogue. Quiet, private, but real. And in a media world built on volume, that silence between two minds felt like the loudest thing of all. It didn't take long. Jessica's essay was published the next morning on a major op-ed site, quietly. No splashy headline, no clickbait thumbnail, just her words and the weight behind them. It started as a whisper online, but as readers scrolled, something happened that rarely happens anymore. People paused, not to argue, not to dunk, not to repost with a hot take. They just read. In the piece, Jessica reflected on how easy it is to react instead of reflect, especially during live debate. She described the moment she walked off set not as a retreat, but as a reset, a decision not to shout louder, but to think deeper. She admitted she was still angry, still unsettled, but she also admitted something else, that Zohran's restraint had forced her to confront how quickly we demand clarity from ideas without sitting long enough to see their shadows. Zohran didn't share the essay. He didn't need to. Others did, writers, teachers, even a few fellow organizers. By noon, it was trending, not because of outrage, but because of how rare it was, a TV moment that ended in division, now turning into something else entirely. Something almost civil. Back on the 5, Greg Gutfeld opened that night's segment with a smirk. No walk-offs today, unless Zohran comes back and drops another truth bomb. The panel laughed, lighter now. Even Jessica returned later that week, briefly, carefully, but with purpose. This time she wasn't there to spar. She was there to listen. And viewers noticed. One poll showed a surprising shift. Viewers who had initially taken a hard side, either with Zohran Mamdani or Jessica Tarlov, were now saying the same thing. "I hadn't thought about it like that." Not agreement, reconsideration. which in a culture obsessed with taking sides, felt almost revolutionary. Podcasts picked up the story, not the drama, but the aftermath. A well-known political analyst said on air, "I expected a culture war brawl. What we got was a rare glimpse of what dialogue looks like when the two people stop trying to win." Zohran was asked to appear on 3 late-night shows. He declined all of them. Jessica was invited to speak at a university panel on cultural criticism and modern storytelling. She accepted, but insisted Zohran's quiet email reply be read aloud before her remarks. The host agreed, and that night in a packed auditorium, a quiet voice read one simple sentence into a microphone. "I read it twice. Thank you for writing it." The room went still. No applause, just silence. The kind of silence that means people are really hearing something for the first time in a long time. And somewhere in Queens, Zohran Mamdani stood alone on a sidewalk overlooking an elevated train line. A late train rumbled by. A breeze tugged at his coat. He smiled, just slightly, not because he had won anything, but because for once someone had stopped the noise and started paying attention. The viral moment faded, as all things do, but something stayed behind. Not the argument, not the headlines, something deeper. Zohran Mamdani never returned to the 5. He didn't need to. His presence had done what few guests ever manage, shift the ground beneath the conversation. Not by overpowering, not by outshouting, but by staying still while everyone else rushed to react. Jessica Tarlov kept appearing on air. Still sharp, still passionate, but changed, not softened, refined. She spoke with more space between her words. Not hesitancy, deliberation. She no longer chased the final word, she chased better questions. In one panel, weeks later, as a heated discussion spiraled into the familiar noise, Jessica leaned in and said quietly, "Can we pause for a moment and ask what we're really afraid of?" The studio went silent, because they had heard that before, from someone they hadn't expected to agree with. And suddenly, it didn't feel like sides anymore. It felt like a mirror. Outside of media circles, schools started picking up the episode and the essay as a case study, an example of cultural tension, handled not with combat, but with restraint. Political science professors taught the moment not as an argument over policy, but as a debate over who gets to shape the American narrative. A journalism class at Columbia University titled its midterm prompt, "Walk off or speak up. When is silence the loudest move?" And in living rooms, online forums, in classrooms across the country, people started asking questions they hadn't asked in years. What does it mean to tell a story? Who decides if it's dangerous or necessary? Can two people disagree publicly and still respect each other privately? Zohran and Jessica never shared a stage again, but they didn't need to. Their exchange lingered. Proof that a televised moment doesn't have to end in screaming or silence. It can end in depth. It can end in pause. And for a media culture that rewards heat over light, that pause felt revolutionary. Jessica continued writing, now exploring broader cultural themes. Her following grew, not because she had walked off that day, but because she had come back and finished the conversation. Zohran, meanwhile, quietly announced a final campaign, not for office, for a story, not a protest, not a rally, a small, character-driven project about two people forced to confront a shared past from opposite ends of the political spectrum. No slogans, no saviors, just conversation. When asked in a rare interview why he chose that story, Zohran answered simply, "Because now I think people might finally listen." And when that story premiered a year later, Jessica was in the audience. Front row, no cameras, no applause, just her and the screen, watching, listening, and for once, not waiting to respond. Because the story didn't need a winner. It needed an audience brave enough to sit with what was real and walk away changed.